You're listening to Open Conversations on Learning Matters, a podcast discussing the challenges our children face in today's educational system and the future of education in the digital age.
Welcome to Open Conversations on Learning Matters. We are your hosts. I'm Brian Hack and Alec Ostrom. I'm a retired 30-year veteran high school teacher. I'm also a professional guitarist, currently playing with a group called Chicago the Tribute here on the West Coast. But we've been inactive this past year for obvious reasons. And now Alec will fill you in on his background.
Hi there, my name is Alec Ostrom, and I also have a family nickname, Ike, which came from my grandfather on my dad's side of the family. I too am a retired educator with over 31 years, and first 10 years I was a social studies teacher, high school social studies teacher. Then I became a vice principal for 8 years, a principal for 6 years, and then I finished up my career as assistant superintendent for curriculum and instruction. And along the way, I got to know Mr. Brian Hack, and we became good friends and colleagues, and we've been working together for a long time. And what we're hoping to do with this series of conversations is to really engage you, our audiences, in an open conversation about what's going on with K-12 in our country, in our nation. And we're really hoping to have a series of programs. We're going to explore various topics. And right now, I'm going to turn it back to Brian to talk a little bit about the current context that we find ourselves in right now in our nation and the current context for what's going on with K-12 education.
So this program is the first in a series of programs that we plan to bring to you every 2 weeks or so. And our goal is to inform you about what is really happening in K-12 school systems and to engage you in open conversations about learning matters. We will begin today with a dialogue on what is generally known as the standards movement or the Standards Education Reform Program. And Alec will quickly summarize that for you.
Okay. And I think, Brian, before we get into that, let me ask you a question, if I may. As you see it right now in our nation, we are struggling with several interconnected, very large challenges. So I'll start that off, and then maybe you can pick up on that. The first one, obviously, is the pandemic. And as we will be discussing in this series, the pandemic has really exposed a lot of very serious flaws in our K-12 education systems. But there are some other interconnected challenges that we're also facing right now. So, Brian, how do you see that?
The teachers that we spoke with, they're incredibly stressed out right now. And they also reflected the fact that a lot of students are stressed out. It's just a very difficult time to be a teacher because while you're trying to teach, you're constantly worried about the situation in which you teach. If you're doing the online learning, a lot of people in the teaching profession really weren't exactly prepared to just jump into that and do that effectively right from square one. Then if you get into the issue of schools trying to open, return with kids on campus, you get into this whole issue of how do you distance students 6 feet apart, kids masking or not masking up. And so while all of that is going on and teachers are supposedly trying to teach a curriculum, in the back of their mind, they're constantly thinking about that safety factor. Now, to give you an example of that, I will be sitting at home watching a television, and I'm watching people in front of me, and the first thing I think of is, why aren't they masked up? And so obviously it's, well, okay, this is a commercial that was done, 2019,
Right.
So,
Pre-COVID.
yeah. So that's always going on in my mind is, why are people not masked up? And it's the first thing that pops into my brain when I see other people. And I've got to believe for teachers that's constantly on their mind. They're thinking about their own personal safety. Am I going to catch something, bring it home to my family? Kids are worried about that. It's become a political nightmare conversation rather than a conversation about medical advice from professionals that are trying to figure out everything that they can and keep the people informed.
Yeah, and I think you really hit on something there that's very important here, and that is teaching in and of itself in K-12 right now, prior to the pandemic, was very difficult.
Right.
And with the pandemic, it is almost impossible because the teachers are being asked to do the impossible. Some districts have adopted what they call hybrid models, where the kids come in some days, other days they're at home. Some districts have adopted models where the teachers have to do both in-person teaching and online teaching. Mm-hmm. And a lot of teachers simply haven't had a lot of training in online teaching, so it's very hard for them. And then the in-person part, we're dealing with classrooms and buildings that in many cases are old. So their air circulation systems are old. They don't work very well. Right. There's not enough room in the classrooms to space the kids out properly. You have various kids who show up without a mask. You have parents who are opposed to wearing masks. There's all kinds of stuff going on that the teachers have to put up with and try to teach. And so I think that context, though, is very important because, as you said, we were going to talk today a little bit about what we call the standards movement.
Right.
And we've been working on that going all the way back. It started in 2002 in the George W. Bush administration. And they decided that we as a nation were behind. We were not doing as well as we should be on international tests, on standardized tests, and that our students were not their test scores were not as good as those of students from other nations. So in 2002, Congress, in a bipartisan effort, passed what was called No Child Left Behind. And essentially what that program did is it set up some very specific standards in the beginning, primarily in mathematics and in English language arts. Later on, that got expanded to include science and history and social studies, but the beginning was just mathematics and English language arts. And they got a group of people together. They looked at all of the standards and they designated these new standards. And they said that every year, those standards, the difficulty was going to gradually increase. Okay. And that each year, the students would be given standardized tests in the spring of each year in April. And that each school and each school district, pardon me, had to meet what were called annual yearly progress, or AYP targets.
Yep.
Okay. So we did that. And the first 5 years or 6 years of that, the increases were pretty gradual. And then from 2006 to 2009, they pretty much just left them the same. They didn't increase them because they began to discover that half of the schools were falling further and further behind. Then, after the election of President Obama, they decided that the right thing to do was to radically increase the difficulty. So they started off each year really increasing the difficulty of the tests and the standards. And of course, what happened was even more students fell further and further behind. And the teachers were having more and more difficulty teaching all of this and covering all of this, because one of the realities with our K-12 school systems is the calendar we use, the annual calendar, hasn't changed since the 1950s.
Right.
We've increased it a little bit. We now have, in most districts, 180 days of instruction, which is not nearly enough time to cover all the standards.
Now, you look at other industrialized nations; they all have much larger calendars.
Yeah, most of the other countries we compete with are at 210, 220, right. 230. I think South Korea is at 240 days.
Right.
And their school days, ours are 6.5 hours. Theirs are longer. They go 7 hours, 7.5, sometimes 8 hours. Okay.
And then you have to factor in, as you well know, that we have an agricultural calendar aspect. Right. The summer is off.
Right.
So the kids are supposed to stay home and help parents bring in the crops, which in our current industrial society, I'm not sure how effective that works anymore. But kids come back in August or September, and the big game is, can you even remember all the stuff that you learned or had taken in the last week of school?
Yeah,
so you have this huge gap. You know,
the really difficult thing with the No Child Left Behind program was, especially in the first 7-8 years,
right?
The legislation established some very serious punishments.
Mm-hmm.
So if your school or your district did not meet the federal targets, teachers could be fired, principals could be fired, schools could be closed. And parents were told, if your daughter or your son or your daughter is in a school with low test scores, you have the right to transfer them to another school or to transfer them to another district. So we had, increasing numbers of schools and increasing numbers of districts that simply never could meet the federal targets. Now, why not? Well, because they had a lot of students from low-income families. They had a lot of students who were English language learners. They didn't speak English very well, or they didn't read it very well. And as we know, standardized tests are really reading tests.
Yep.
That's what they are.
Right.
So if you're a poor reader or a non-reader, your test scores are going to be low, and it's not a true measurement, really, of what you know. So by 2015, so many districts and schools had fallen behind. Congress and President Obama gave up.
Well,
they congratulated themselves and said, this has been a wonderful thing, but we have to make it better. So then they got another group of people together, and they created a new standards program called the Common Core State Standards.
Yeah.
And I will now turn it back to Brian, who will give you the true name of that education reform program.
Well, we used to refer to all of those classes as core, C-O-R-E, and or the Common Core, as teachers used to call it. I always referred to it as the Common Bore, because that's basically what it did. It bored the hell out of all of our students.
Yes.
By the time you get to 2015, and at that particular time, I'm kind of starting to keep my eye on the retirement prize. A lot of veteran teachers, myself included, we had pretty well recognized the variations of games that different schools and districts were coming up with to try to come to terms with NCLB. I can remember the high school that I was at, we actually had a Raise the Scores rally. So the entire population of 2,000 students are in this huge gymnasium, and the student government teacher and different people are running around, putting on this big show of Raise the Scores. And there was a lot of ways that some teachers And a lot of students responded with that. First of all, students became well aware of the fact that the scores had no impact directly on their lives. It did not inhibit their ability to graduate. It was a score that showed up months after you had gone through all these exams. And so there was some irony in that. For me as a veteran teacher, it was sometimes almost very difficult to get in front of a group of kids and keep a straight face. I'm looking down at their scantrons as I'm monitoring these exams, which usually took anywhere from a week to 2 weeks in terms of the school calendar. And a lot of them would pencil diagrams, pictures on their scantrons. They're not trying to answer the questions. They know it has no impact on their lives. So they're just whatever, blowing off the test. So then suddenly the vice principals are spending half their day bringing these kids in, these rebellious young people that are making patterns all over their scantrons, and trying to counsel them and correct them with, this isn't cool. The other thing that happened is there was some real tension between teachers. Some teachers, for example, their entire curriculum just moved to teaching to the test. Some states, obviously, as it was reported, there was clear-cut examples of cheating going on. Teachers so worried about their jobs that they're actually bubbling in and erasing after school correct answers to try to, up the scores, so to speak. If you were a particular school where, for example, let's say it's February or March, this time of year, for example, and all of a sudden a new student comes in and they're from a different part of the world where English is not their first language. And suddenly, a couple months later, they've only been in your class a couple of weeks, and suddenly they're thrown into this standardized testing situation, which, as you said, as we both have researched, it's a reading test. Even if you're taking the math test, it's a reading test because it's your ability to comprehend what the question is asking. Okay, so these young folks are obviously right at a disadvantage. And suddenly, and I remember this, some teachers became very irritated because I now have the student that's transferred from another state or another part of the world or some other school system. Now they're here, they're taking this test, which they're going to have a lot of trouble with it. And this school is now going to be punished for what this young person learned in some other scenario that we had no control over. But that becomes part of our school-wide test scores.
Oh, yeah.
So a lot of these inequities. There were stories of one particular principal that figured this out, almost telling the school, "Don't improve too much. Just improve a little bit so we can stretch this out a couple more years." You got all these games going on.
Well, there were some districts that I'm aware of in other states where there was some serious cheating going on.
Yes.
And the teachers were cheating because they had such huge pressure put on them to raise the scores. And so they were, giving the kids answers or even erasing what their bubbles and putting in the correct answers and playing all kinds of games.
Yeah.
But one of the cutest stories was one of the folks that I worked with back in the day with a company. They specialized in test security. And so they were consultants, and districts could hire them to make sure that test security was solid. So they were dealing with a school district, I think, back somewhere in the Midwest. And from one year to the next, the scores had just gone up tremendously. Huge improvement.
Right.
So everybody suspected that there was some cheating going on. So they hired this company. The company went in and they talked with all the teachers individually and took a look at the test papers to see if there were erasures. They did this big analysis and they couldn't find anything. There were no erasures. The tests had been given properly. The supervision was proper. Everything was cool. So they talked to the principal. They talked to the superintendent and said, we don't know what's going on here, but none of the teachers cheated. Okay, we're very sure of that. The administrators, the test was given properly, supervised properly, but there is something going on here. Okay, this increase in scores is way outside of the norm. So one of the teachers raised her hand and said, have you guys talked with the students?
What a concept.
What a concept. And they said, good idea. So they scheduled a bunch of interviews to pick students at random from different grade levels, and they interviewed the students. And most of the students said, I don't know. I just took the test. It's boring. I really didn't like it. I did my best, but, I don't know. So finally, they found this one young man. And he said, well, of course, we worked very hard to increase our scores. And they said, you did? And he said, yes. And they said, well, what did you do? And he said, well, we formed a team of us. We had about 8 guys, and we all took our cell phones.
Yep.
While we were taking the test, and we took pictures of the pages of the test, and we took them home. We figured out the right answers, and then we sent them out to everybody. We figured it would be good if everybody knew the right answers.
Very successful business strategy that would fit very well in today's corporate world,
Yeah. So,
yeah.
But the end of this story is that as the Congress finally canceled No Child Left Behind and installed what is now called the Common Core State Standards, we still kept having the same problems. Okay. And even today, we're still doing all this standardized testing. Now it's in math, English, science, history, social studies. You and I refer to that as MESH.
Yes.
Okay. But the test scores aren't improving. In fact, over the time, they've gotten worse.
Right.
Okay. So back in about 2007, 2008, you and I and our former partner, a gentleman by the name of Don Prentice, we started analyzing all of this. We started doing a lot of research, and we came to a conclusion that, there's something wrong here. There's something definitely wrong. And what we concluded was that the system, the K-12 education system, was broken and obsolete.
It had become very apparent to a lot of veteran teachers in subtle ways that the standards movement had infiltrated and almost as a monster had taken over every aspect of public education.
Everything.
I remember, for example, I'm at a meeting at the beginning, the opening of school. I think I talked about this in our book. But a young gal right out of college, just been hired, makes the comment, I'm so excited to be teaching the state standards. And I remember looking at her and saying, well, I'm very excited to be teaching students.
Yep.
And the point to that is that it had infiltrated almost everything. The college system had now shifted to this model of preparing their candidates to be in that mode of standardized teaching. The textbook companies were now putting out textbooks that were all, wrapped around this standards movement. I even remember a young teacher getting very upset, a veteran teacher, by the way, 15-year veteran teacher, and she's got a vice principal in her room criticizing her on teacher evaluations because she did not write the standard of that particular lesson on the board in front of the classroom. So it was becoming, oh my gosh, I had this visions of Nazi Germany going through my brain as I'm thinking about what has happened. It's just taken over,
Right.
and creative thought, doing lessons that are innovative, all of that stuff was taking a back seat to making sure that you do this. And in fact, a lot of teachers, the conversations at lunchtime and whatnot was all of comparing notes about where each one was in the curriculum and were they all on the same page.
Right.
So it really it took over, and it just became a monster. And I would say in today's school environment, in addition to the pandemic, it's made it a very stressful profession. In fact, with so many schools doing so poorly on their test scores, and then parents, okay, I'm going to take my child and go to another school or another district, the assumption was that all of that existed. Like there's magically another teacher down the street who's much more qualified and really determined to, help your student.
Yeah.
Well, if you fire all these people, if you go check the colleges, they're not all lined up, standing out front, waiting to be hired to take over. It did not exist.
Right.
Colleges are saying it's people have dropped out.
What we've seen in the last 10 years or so.
Yeah.
Is the number of college grads who are choosing teaching profession has gone way down.
Yes, it has.
Because the word is out. It's terrible.
Right.
You're forced into this system where you have to cover, quote unquote, cover so many standards every day and every unit and every semester and every year. And your whole focus in teaching is to prepare these kids for a test that has no meaning. It doesn't affect their graduation, does not affect college entrance, does not do anything. So
if you were an elective teacher, it was a very stressful time.
Right.
Now, in my own career, the first half of my career, I was a social science teacher. I taught economics, government to seniors. I was an AP teacher. Did AP American history and AP European history. And then all of a sudden I'm in the visual and performing arts program. I'm teaching a guitar program at a high school. I've got intermediate, beginning, advanced guitars, 2 of those curriculums that I wrote for the district. But now all of a sudden it's the pressure from other teachers. If they're core teachers like English, science, history, and whatnot, you feel like if you're not a math teacher, you're not doing your job because what you teach is really not that significant. Yet most elective teachers, with the enthusiasm and the motivation that they saw with their students, it's like, wow, this is the one thing going on in the school day that actually gets kids to show up and be excited about coming to school.
Exactly.
There's a real it really was a divide and conquer type program is what it amounted to, the standards movement.
Well, and I think we're probably getting toward the end of our time for this first broadcast. But the other thing, we did 2 other things that were very important that we're going to be talking about in this series. The first one is we decided that what no one had been doing in all of this education reform business and all this standards business, no one was having any conversations with the students. So we did.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked to a number of students, as you know, and they told us consistently that it just bored them to tears. They didn't understand why they had to do this. It had no meaning for them. It had no added value for them. It was very frustrating for them. And bottom line, after they left high school, they were saying, hey, I am really struggling. I'm having a hard time out here. I'm having a hard time in college if I chose to go to college, and I'm having a hard time getting a job. And I'm just not well prepared to get a job or to do a career. And so the second thing we did is then we did a lot of research and we talked to a lot of different employers across a whole wide range of careers. And we said, okay, when you go to hire somebody, what are the skill sets you want to see when you hire a new employee or a new manager? And they told us. So we recorded all of that, we organized it, and then we went back and compared it to what the standards were requiring in K-12. And what we discovered was there was only about a 15% overlap.
Yeah.
So saying it another way, if we look at the skill sets, knowledge, skills, attitudes, behaviors that kids need after high school in the job market, 85% of those skill sets are not taught in K-12.
The very term cover the standards always bothered me. It's like covering a book. It's like you're hiding something. You're just covering something.
Yep.
And as you know, when we worked with Don and the program that we developed, very set skill sets, wide open, because it's never finished. It's an ongoing process.
Right.
But the idea is to say to young people, school is the place where you practice and you have the time to practice and develop specific skills, which are very much needed in the adult world. I mean, our first digital age skill set is focused on lifelong learning.
Exactly.
And I thought that was very unique that we went through that, because we take almost a full page explaining clearly what that is. Now, schools love to use that term. They love to, we believe in lifelong learning.
Yeah.
But when you really sit down and get into a dialogue with people about that, you just discover very quickly schools like to use terms when they really don't seem to comprehend the full meaning and context of what that entails.
Yeah, and they're simply not doing it.
No, they're not.
Because the whole standards movement is the exact opposite of lifelong learning. And the term of art is teach it, test it, forget it.
Yeah.
That's what the standards movement is. You memorize all these factoids, you take the standardized test,
flush it out of your life and move on.
Yeah. And when we talked with the students, that's what they said.
Right.
We did that every year. We were good kids. We did what we were told. We memorized all this stuff. We took this test, and then we promptly flushed it out of our minds because it was meaningless.
Right.
And so it's like, okay, that raised a very large question for us. And that question was, okay, what do we do about this problem? What do we do about this situation? And we came to a conclusion that was, you can't fix the present K-12 systems.
That was a real shock.
Yeah.
Because I remember when we finally came to that conclusion, it was almost like coming out of a bubble.
Yep.
I actually could not have that conversation with fellow teachers, or very few, to actually look at another teacher like myself. After 25 years, I taught 30 years, but I mean, even after 25 years, I'm down to the last few years, and I'm having these conversations, trying to look at other people and say, the entire system is broken.
Yep.
And the ironic thing about that is that a lot of people would agree with you. When I had the conversation with parents, a lot of parents would agree with me.
Yep.
The problem then became, what do you do about it?
Right.
There is the problem.
And the breakthrough came from our good friend, Don Prentice, who he passed away a couple of years ago. He said, fellas, what we've got to do is we have to transcend the present system. You can't fix it. You can't reform it. You can't, you're just, it's old, it's obsolete, it's broken. There's nothing you can do with it. You've got to go way beyond it. You got to go to a completely new model. And that is exactly what we started working on in 2010. And that produced our first book, which is, you see the sign behind me, and Here's a copy of our first book with all my bookmarks in it. Listening to our students, a radical idea, and transcending K-12 to save our nation.
Right.
And that is exactly what we're going to be talking about in this series. And we're going to have some open conversations. And we know that we've raised a lot of questions here on purpose. And I'm sure that the folks who watch this and listen to this will be wondering, well, wait a second, how exactly does that work? And how do we get to that new model? And how, what's that all about? So in the next few series, next few programs, we'll be talking about all of that and answering people's questions and talking about our books. And we really like this new model, folks, and I think you're going to like it too. So,
well, the idea is to master skill sets.
Exactly.
And they have the time, the motivation, and the other thing about a lot of these, especially in our book, when we shared those with students and with parents, the typical reaction was, "Wow."
They love it.
Why? This is what we should be doing in school. This is the stuff we should be. I'd be really motivated if I could come to school and learn that.
Exactly. Well, and if you think about it, as you learned in your wonderful guitar program that you set up, and we know this from adult life, the kids in your program learned that if you're going to master the guitar, you have to practice. There's no shortcuts. And so by the time they got to be advanced guitar students, they had done that. And the other key is they knew that they had to perform.
Right.
And you communicated with them, hey, there's an industry standard here. Okay. There are requirements in professional music that are expected, and you have to perform at those levels. Okay. This isn't amateur hour anymore. There's very strict standards in the professional music business, quality levels that you have to meet. And the only way to get there is practice.
Yeah.
And so the present system simply does not have enough time.
No.
It doesn't have enough time for kids to practice anything, really, other than if they happen to be in a specialized program like yours. So one of the things we did in our model is back in 2010, we had a little weekend session. We invited a bunch of people, teachers, students, parents, grandparents, employers, counselors, all different kinds of folks. And we said, okay, if we're going to change the present system, what should the time frame look like? And the answer was loud and clear. Hey, the schools should be open 24/7, 365.
Yep.
All the time. They should be wide open all the time so that any student can learn anything from anyone at any time and anywhere.
Right.
Yeah. So,
I mean, if I want to learn how to speak Japanese, I may be online with my teacher at 4:00 in the morning.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
And I may adjust my schedule around that to accommodate that.
Well, and as we've learned from the pandemic, many people these days are working from home.
Yes, they are.
And their time schedules are whatever they are.
Yeah.
So it isn't, 9 to 5 anymore. It's whatever it needs to be. And if you listen to the students, they will tell you, man, you guys are out of it. Why can't we just learn whenever we need to? It's right there.
Yeah.
And the answer is, you're absolutely right. You should be able to. So anyway, I think at this point, we'll call it good for the first session.
Well, this concludes our first show, and we're hoping that we can get some interesting questions and comments from people. We're going to try to continue this process and get one of these out about every 2 weeks or so on open conversations on learning matters. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I got a dozen roses for the girl upstairs, living on the second floor. I hear my favorite song on a radio.